Yeah, I would like to really, I completely agree with that. I think the scale and the way we are looking at projects really needs to change. So for CARE, we have, since a couple of years, really made the shift from a project-based to a program-based approach. And with a program approach, we mean a very long time frame, maybe 10, 15 years, instead of the 3-year projects we are often working in, or even shorter when it comes to humanitarian projects. So although those projects stay our reality, we are really building that longer term vision and make sure all our projects align to that. So in order for us to design our programming, it is particularly important to really understand the underlying causes of vulnerability, what erodes the resilience of people, and then to design what we call a theory of change that spans across this 10, 15 years time frame to really help them on that trajectory out of poverty. And in doing that, again, like I said earlier, we need to integrate, this understanding of the risks, helping to reduce the risks, adaptation approaches, so that really we can make sure that people stay on that trajectory. What I think is also very important is to take an approach that goes beyond countries. As we know, and we often talk about resilience related to droughts, which then is very much linked to political issues as well, that spans across countries. So in West Africa, we have, for example, designed our Sahel resilience strategy, which really looks at the Sahel across, which really helps us to understand, for example, the vulnerabilities and potential of mobile populations such as pastoralists, and also to understand the markets, because we know that prices, stocks, markets, all these issues are very important to understand in order to really tackle the vulnerability of people. I would also like to add to these community approaches. I think it's also very important. So, and then especially to integrate, not only to work on a household level and on a community level, but to integrate scientific and local approaches. So we have designed this, what we call participatory scenario planning, where communities, NGOs, local government, as well as maybe more scientific institutions or meteorologist institutions come together to look at scenarios, weather forecasts, for example, and to plan together. And then also to make plans to disseminate this information to other communities, for example, through radios or radio programs or religious services.
That's great. That captures some of both how organizations are planning sort of from the top, but then also how you're engaging communities. Are there other examples that others of you would share about how you're really engaging communities or working with them differently?
Yeah, so there's one of the things that I think is, kind of slightly one of these unexpected outcomes of this process, and that's that through more of this resilience lens, what we're tending to do wherever it's possible is to shift out of the idea of free into a fee-based services approach. So in many of the programs that we used to do where we work with communities and provide assets to people, now I think a lot of the programming that we're doing is probably more skills focused, but also providing skills through local entrepreneurs. And that kind of more sort of business-like solution to resilience programming allows us to do things in very different ways. So, we can look at more sustainable solutions because we are building the capacity of local community members to develop their own business ideas. That process brings in a lot more co-investment to the process, so we get a lot more leverage in the investments that we're making. I think this idea of lowering service fees in terms of the grant money that we are using and leveraging that, as Baba was saying, with local governments, but also leveraging it with the local private sector, is a really important process in the type of work that we're doing. And of course, through going through that process, we have to slow down our approach a little bit in order to get people up to speed with this entrepreneurial approach. But once that's working, then we can apply that logic to many different areas. So whether that's financial services, whether it's paravets, whether if it's business advisory services, anything which has some connection to the market, we can start to bring in a fee-based approach to that, and that allows us to scale in a very different way than we were doing in the past.
Great.
There's one other change actually that I know that Mercy Corps and other organizations have started to take more seriously as part of their resilience thinking, and that's really trying to get stronger on managing adaptively. And this is not unique to resilience, but I think the fact that resilience programming in many ways is uncharted territory, where we're not sure how to predict how our support is going to interact, forces us to move away from kind of a big upfront planning model towards much more iterative programming where we are replanning at key moments along the way. So interestingly, that's been talked about for a long time, and I'm starting to get some really good examples these days of actually how you do that as a program team. So in Karamoja, for example, they have quarterly meetings where teams are bringing insights and M&E data from the field to essentially revisit and rework their program logic. So, results chains on the wall, everything's up for grabs, new relationships put in there, others taken out. So that's a real sort of practical example of how adaptive management looks like there. And I think that there are some serious implications for how we do program monitoring and evaluation to be able to feed that kind of learning.
That's great, John. Resilience is giving us a lot to think about, not just in terms of how we approach the initial planning phase, but then as you've said, how we change how we're doing things in the middle of a program cycle when perhaps we've already secured funding. And you bring up an important point about monitoring and evaluation. Resilience is a new thing that we're trying to work into our development work. So what does it mean to measure resilience? Mark, I'm going to turn to you as someone speaking from Cornell University who's done tremendous work on measuring resilience. If you can share some insights from your perspective.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to say first that just describe very briefly the measurement enterprise and how resilience influences how we approach that enterprise. Overall, the basic aim of measurement as we approach it is to increase precision and sensitivity of measurement. And while building on existing measures that we use in the field, resilience does introduce a special set of requirements on both what is measured and indeed how it's measured. So let me focus very briefly on the what and the how part in the interest of increasing precision and sensitivity. On the what measure, it increases draws special attention to the array of shocks and stressors that threaten well-being both in the short term and the long term. And in order to build sensitivity in that area, we need to pay special attention both to the catastrophic events that typically draw attention, but also, as was mentioned by panelists here, on the low grade, but also very corrosive chronic stressors that are present. Within that, it's important also to look at both subjective and objective elements of those stressors and shocks. At the core of resilience measurement is focusing very closely on the set of capacities that prepare households, indeed individuals in the first instance at a smaller scale, households, communities, and larger entities to both prepare for and respond to shocks in a manner that allows them to mitigate, absorb, adapt, and in some instances transform in the face of those shocks. A third element of what needs to be focused on is the post-shock status, and not simply looking at it as a point estimate or as a static measure, but as mentioned by some of the panelists here, looking at it as a trajectory over time. And this gives me an opportunity to transition the measurement discussion from the what to the how part and the special requirements that resilience introduces. And the first one introduces is looking at time scale. And it's important to look at trajectories over time and how they behave. And in fact, how households respond to shocks. And in fact, if we look at recovery at one point in time, what happens over a 3, 4, 5-year period may be indeed very different. And Crystal's comment and what CARE is doing is vital here, looking at it in a longer time trajectory. Another important element is looking at it as a multi-level and nested construct, and that it's individuals nested within households, within communities, and higher aggregates. And these two elements together, I think, create a really important bridge, thinking about time, the time dimension for recovery, and the structural elements in individuals and households, and how those things connect to theories of change. Indeed, and this is why we do measurement. We're trying to understand what the impacts of interventions are, and measurement must serve those objectives. So I think one of the core elements of measurement is being able to look at the trajectories element and having the appropriate time frame and with the appropriate scale. So.
I can give a sense of how some of that thinking looks on the ground. So Mercy Corps and other partners have worked with Cornell, Tango, and other research institutes to try to apply some of this resilience measurement thinking in the field. I'll draw on a study we did in southern Somalia last year, which was essentially done to try to look at what factors made a difference to the likelihood that households were able to cope with the famine in 2010 and 11 more productively than others. So just exploiting kind of the range of outcomes there, not looking at any particular intervention. And here, the purpose of it really was to test some of the assumptions that we go into resilience programming or thinking with. I think this concept is loaded with a lot of untested ideas that have good merit, but really yet to sort of be tested. So in this case, we were able to do some real putting to the test of ideas and coming out with some new learning. So in some cases, some of the factors that we almost knew would associate with stronger resilience or successful coping certainly stood out. So extended social networks in the Somali context, not surprising that made a difference. Others that we thought would make a difference didn't. So for example, livelihood diversity, which is often touted as something that is key to resilience, at least in the form that it's typically measured in the sense of multiple income sources, wasn't linked at all with greater coping ability in that instance. And then other factors that we didn't really have any reason to believe would make a difference jumped out. So for example, women's involvement in household decision-making in some ways placed them in a better position to be able to manage household assets and access services during that crisis. So for us and others, it's helping to identify leverage points amongst the big landscape of factors that we think may make a difference, and that's translating, I think, into more targeted programming.
Great, thanks, John. Mark, I'm going to come back to you to see if you have other thoughts. I mean, John has brought up the idea of how NGOs are trying to do this resilience measurement, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how NGOs are doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, it's a point I wanted to raise, and being aware of time, I clipped something off. Something that we're doing, I think, is very vital, and it's an important, I think, indicator of how this Resilience Learning Consortium works, is CARE has supported some work we're doing at Cornell University, which is brought under the title of Resilience Sensitivity Analysis, and we're taking a close look at baseline measures for some of the programs that CARE has launched, and also then hopefully branching that out to programs that the other NGOs are launching, and looking at the particular properties of those baseline measures and saying what is in place that we can build upon, and where are the gaps in order to strengthen those measures moving forward. Because we know there are elements that can be built upon, but also we know that there are gaps. Indeed, if resilience is a new construct, is a new idea, it's quite likely that there is an additional burden placed on measurement. We're trying to get that balance right, not introducing burdens that are simply infeasible, but also moving forward, I think, is vital. So thanks.
Great, thanks. So we've heard a lot about how resilience is reshaping how organizations do their programming, from the need for rigorous analysis to the need to integrate risk, different ways of working with communities, ways of being flexible throughout a program cycle so that we're actually adapting the way a program is implemented. There's tremendous discussion going on about resilience. And as I said at the beginning, we have 3 days of high-level discourse about resilience. So I'm wondering if there are things that we're missing. What is not necessarily coming out in the discourse about resilience that really does need to be featured? Christelle, I'm actually going to start with you for that question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there is a tendency in the resilience discourse to place a lot of emphasis on the households and communities. And I sometimes feel like we are putting a lot of burden on them. They are supposed to become more resilient, Whereas if you really engage in an analysis of the underlying causes of their vulnerability, that really brings you to the more deeper rooted, inequalities in society and issues like weak governance, for example. So I really think it's very important to, in addition to looking at the households and communities, also looking at the enabling environment and really try to build resilient systems, for example, on the government side, but also in those communities. And one, I think we touched upon the gender issue, which I think is extremely important because societies really treat women and men different, and their vulnerabilities are different. So it is very important to really also understand the power dynamics in households, in communities, in society, so that we really help to overcome some of these inequalities.